Welcome once again to our study of logic of faith, a Buddhist approach to finding certainty beyond belief and doubt. So this is our fifth installment. We didn't quite manage to cover as much as I would have liked to last time, but still I think we'll be all right. Now, last time we've looked at something really interesting, which is challenging the ordinary dichotomy, the conflict between belief and doubt, where we on one hand have belief as an assertion, which is not necessarily grounded in us being sensitive to the nature of our reality, but more a determined frozen assumption. And as a consequence, then doubt is really when we see how these assumptions don't hold up. What we're proposing here with what Elizabeth calls the tradition of Pratitya Samutpada, the tradition that sees that we really live in a web of phenomena that operate within conditioning, what she calls everything leans, is that we could find certainty in the sense of not necessarily having to assert this or that, but rather approach reality with this appreciation of awe or grace and the wisdom that doesn't necessarily take sides for or against, sees the larger picture. So we looked at that last, and as a consequence also then we have these two positions that are somewhat associated. You could say the eternalist view, which is the notion that there must be something, there is something which is the ultimate building block of our reality. There is some absolute truth that is unconditionally truth, no matter where we look at it from. It will always be true. It is true in any given context and so forth. This, of course, is, if we look, not really going to happen. But the reaction towards that, when we say we have some absolute, yes, this is the absolute truth in this one way, or this is always true, and so forth, we always have these annoying people that come along and ask questions. Really? Is that really it? And so forth. And that's where, when we then find the flaws of this position, that we then fall into this thing that where we say, well, there's nothing there. That was not what we thought it was. Hence, we now don't believe in anything, which is nihilism. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, I'd like you to please feel comfortable to ask questions. I was a little bit worried that there weren't any questions last time. I was thinking, I hope I'm presenting this in a way that it's understandable. There's, however, two things which really are essential for this, and that is that you're actually reading this, and it is Dharma study. That means it's moving us. It's moving us from one place to the other. So it takes reflection, and as such, then it's work. There is work in this. Also, what I'm doing here is and this is also even more reason to read it, is you're getting my interpretation, my sort of angle on this. And there might well be points that Elizabeth is making which I'm missing, and you might find it, and so forth. You're not getting the refined essence of Elizabeth here, unfortunately. It's a study of a text, but you're of course going to get my particular angle on it. So all the more reason to engage in this. One thing I do, however, hope to convey is and I think I've said this before, my increasing admiration and awe, if you like, of this work. Really, it's so good. It tackles some really big topics, essential topics on the path to enlightenment and renders it really clear and relevant for us who live outside of a traditional Buddhist context, and hence some of the traditional ways of presenting this is not always that easy to follow for us. So this is a big contribution to Buddhism in the modern world. Homage. I pledge allegiance to the experience of grace, the expression of human insight from which all authentic faith traditions have arisen. I pledge allegiance to Mother Emptiness, Prajnaparamita, to the wisdom of the Buddha and the great spiritual genius Nagarjuna. First and foremost, I pledge allegiance to my beloved teacher, Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. So we're in chapter 3 still, faith beyond belief and doubt, nihilism. Is that all there is? The notion of nothing seems to be a mere concept. Can we actually find nothing? On what do we base our fear of nothing extinction? The concept stems from wishing to box reality into the is versus isn't. These boxes are the two extremes of eternalism and nihilism. They are more tendencies than formal philosophical tenets. So the notion of nothing, if we think, have we ever found nothing? There's actually this I hadn't planned on, this just came to mind, but in Alice in Wonderland, there's a place, I think, where the king, he asks Alice to look down the road for somebody. And because he says, my eyes are not so good. Can you see, is there anybody on the road? And my child, since you have good eyes. So she looks down and she says, there's nobody. And the king goes, oh, child, with your good eyes, isn't that amazing that you can see nobody? and this is kind of it. Is there such a thing as seeing nothing? Yes, we could say in the case of Alice not seeing anything that there's nobody, but she's still seeing the road, right? She's still seeing a whole array of things. Try and imagine, is there such a thing as nothing? We might have looked up at the sky like Elizabeth suggests and tried to imagine what's beyond, right? Nothing. So that's the thing. Is nothing anything else except just an idea? Of course, we could have the idea, and that's where she mentions her childhood memory being exposed to the concept again of death, that we could think, oh, all of a sudden there was nothing. But it's hard, it's not something that we normally actually experience. Well, we don't experience, but it's a concept in the absence of something. So this is where we begin to think in terms of absolute ises and absolute isn'ts. And these are where we essentially end up with what has nothing to do with reality. We can already see there, as we have established with the notion of leaning, that the notion of is very relative to where we're seeing it from. And in fact, it's just a label for what in fact are many different conditions. And as such, the notion of existence, for example, my clock or my person, is really just an aggregation that is labeled in one way or another, but there's nothing is about it. And if I were to cut my hair or lose an arm or so forth, can we then say isn't? Well, there isn't an arm, but still, that arm, did it ever have any intrinsic sort of ultimate role? And am I any less? And let's imagine that first my arms were removed, and then they replaced my legs, then the torso by some amazing chance could be sort of replaced, and eventually maybe a new head. And still, I would probably still think that's me, right? These ideas of labeling, they need to be seen for what they are labeling. They work as such, but they don't really convey any ultimate truth in terms of something existing or not existing. These concepts, they don't actually exist in the real world, if you like. They exist in the relative world. Yes, that's fine. But if we were to look into reality, we can't find them. And hence these ways of labeling things, they're tendencies that we operate with, but they're not even particularly philosophical tenets. They're more just human ways of labeling things. Now, when we are presently looking at this notion of nihilism, which is in some way a reaction to having said there was something, right? Nihilism moves us from the truth of a thing to a void, from rightness to doubt, from meaning to insignificance. So we thought there was something, then on the basis of that we say there's not that thing. It might also come as a rigid position that we might have, and then we can see the assumption wasn't valid, then we go over and then we say, oh, then there's not that. And we're all the time missing the point. Nihilism, we can experience it in our ordinary life when we reject ethical values. For example, might have been taught that it's very important to be a nice young boy or a nice young girl. And then when we reject that, we might fall into a place of just having no real direction. So the moment that we can see the assumptions around some of these cultural practices or ethical values that might have been based on rules, saying the good Lord said this is how you should be, or this is how a good person is, then we might come along and says, hey, says who, why, and so forth. And then we're just rejecting these. So that's very often what nihilism is. It's the rejection of some previously existing standards. There, very much it stands in reaction. When that comes, then it's when we're rejecting cause and effect. We might not even particularly, we might just, with the dismissal of values or rules, we might forget the way that things actually operate, because we again just falling into this rejection of some system. When we deny what is intangible and we dismiss metaphysics, so we might have rejected the notion of God, we might have rejected the notion of holiness or the sacred and so forth. We dismiss all the aspects of the traditional religions or the traditional spiritualities and so forth. Now, nihilism is intrinsic, for example, to materialist reductionism, where we just say, well, we haven't found any soul, so all this consciousness business, this soul business, we're not really seeing it. There's nothing but matter. And there we would say, again, that we don't really have any, as a part of that nihilist view also, then we might say, well, you know, you used to think that you had a mind and a conscience and so forth. In fact, that's all just biological impulses. This is where you would say you're nothing but just a network of neurobiological impulses and systems. So we have that. So that's where nihilism is, this rejection of a whole realm of reality, simply because it comes from the point of view of having rejected some assumptions. So again, to just be clear on what we're talking about here, we can juxtapose these two, eternalism and nihilism. To summarize, eternalism, this is Elizabeth speaking, as you can see, EMN. To summarize, eternalism strives to find substantial truths or to identify singular causes to explain why things are the way they are. Whereas nihilism challenges objective truths through analysis or reductionism, which often leads to the rejection of the relative power of meaning and experience. So we have then again, she says, eternalism concretizes and nihilism destroys. So we might have said, well, this is truth. Then somebody says, how is it the truth? Then that concrete idea of truth falls away. Eternalism affirms existence, while nihilism affirms extinction. See, that's why nihilism is tricky. We're looking into this, but the thing is, nihilism then becomes a truth. It's not just that it says that something doesn't hold up. It actually says there was something, we don't believe that, now we believe nothing. So it becomes a dogmatic position. Eternalism, and this is just describing them, eternalism leans toward belief, while nihilism looks at the phenomenal world through doubt and negation. So we would have those that assert things that have to do with the intangible and so forth, asserting something on the basis of trust or perhaps blind faith or belief. The nihilist looks at the phenomenal world through this critical view. And it's not just a critical view, it doesn't, unfortunately, it fails to be critical about itself. And that's where it becomes cynicism. It becomes then nihilism as an absolute. And that's where that then becomes an affirmation, a new dogma of rightness. So again, we have these two, what we call extremes. They're both pointing their guns at each other. They're both opposed to each other. They see a conflict. Elizabeth says, as an attitude or mood, nihilism throws into suspicion our whole raison d'etre. It most often leads to a dreary worldview that promises impending doom, as if you as an individual are all alone to forge your way through a bleak and unfriendly existence. Imagine a life devoid of meaning or purpose. Why bother? It's a rigged game. We all have to die in the end anyway. That's nihilism. Of course, we all have moments of feeling ineffective or of falling into malaise, ennui, or numbness, but most people don't actually want to be nihilistic. It's not an uplifting way to walk through life. So when we look at this in terms of our living experience as inhabitants of the modern world, we see this reflected a lot in the cultural creations, attitudes, practices. We're only going to live once, and the sort of the glee with which one has sort of destroyed some of the traditional assumptions and so forth. This is reflected in music. Elizabeth quotes a songwriter who presented some of these views, but we have it. It's so present within so much of the music that we have. Sort of in the latter 20th century, contemporary music that really denigrates and is down on tradition and assumptions and previously held great values, right? This is also, we have it in the music, in the movies, in our literature and so forth. So all of this, when we are enveloped and situated within, living within this discourse of nihilism, it filters down to us as a truth. And many people are left just from sheer exposure to the modern discourse. Many are left with the truth or the impression there is no meaning or purpose to our existence. So, like the old siddhas, they say, you might be naive if you hold on to the notion of something, but you're seriously stupid if you hold on to the idea of nothing. Nihilism often comes as a result of questioning beliefs and not finding anything. Why should I do this? Well, because that's how we do it. But why do we do it? Well, that's how we've always done it. Why have we always done it? What's the point? And so forth, right? So we don't find good answers. And that's where we then latch on to this non-finding. This non-finding is then taken as an absolute truth. There's nothing. Yeah. It's not about looking into the reality of the conditions. We might criticize some institutions validly, but then not finding something, it doesn't mean that there aren't still conditioning. Conditioning, the whole nature of leaning, defies this notion of nothing as an absolute. There's all the time conditionings taking place. So this stands in stark contrast. This dogmatism stands in stark contrast. This is very different from the loosening practice of seeing relationship. Here, seeing lack of truth merely means seeing that phenomena lean. So we've talked a lot about phenomena being empty, right? We talk about shunyata, that phenomena don't have any truth as such. It doesn't mean that there's nothing. It just means that there's no absolute truth in things, and that's where there is definitely some. You could say there's a small connecting point really with some of the philosophers that we have in the latter 20th century that would say, well, we can't find any absolute philosophy, we can't find any absolute truth. Everything can be dismantled or relativized or deconstructed. Sure, but if we take that as an absolute, if we take that, okay, and this is where the class stops, and then you walk out of the class, then what? Then you're just left with the idea that there's nothing there. It might feel like liberation, but it's so cerebral that we end up ignoring the presence of the lived life that is full of, if you like, meaning, full of significance for us. Maybe not in the absolute, sure, but in our experience, the way that we handle our life and so forth, what we do makes a big difference. There's lots of truths. It's a truth if you see somebody and you bring them a flower, you might say, well, that's all just that's just so meaningless. No, the moment that you give something to somebody, they're happy. That's very big significance in our life, and so forth. So we understand that phenomena lean, but leaning and the lack, like I was just saying, and the lack of inherent identity in no way means nothingness. So when we say that things like truth, that they're empty and so forth, this does not mean nothingness at all. On the contrary, on the one hand, it opens our eyes to the dynamics, the relative nature of cause and effect. It's very empowering. What we do has an impact, cause and effect. On the other hand, it enables us to lay down the burden of beliefs and doubt and live in grace. We're relating to things as they play out in terms of our experience. We are open and we're not relying on beliefs that then can be subjected to doubt. We're living in this experience of the phenomena as they play out in our experience. And that's where we're living in grace. That's where we're relating to something that goes beyond the ordinary way that we pigeonhole reality. We're opening up to something far greater. It works like she's saying, it's laying down the burden, and that's where there's a liberation. And also, it enables us to see the way that we interact with the world. We become not so much held up in ourselves in a frozen way, but we begin to be more participants. Elizabeth says, people do all kinds of things in the name of faith that cause others to reject it. But be careful, because in one of its sneakiest and most harmful guises, nihilism expresses itself as the assumptions that you can only trust what you perceive. And what we perceive is only our particular angle on something. And if we're only looking at something that can be objectively experienced and we fail to see the subject and so forth, there's a whole realm that in fact is the truest of our realities, namely what's felt and experienced within the subjective, that's dismissed. So once we begin to have this nihilist attitude, nihilism prevents us from uniting intentions and actions. If we're alien to what's happening inside in terms of us, if we have previously abided by this is good, this is bad, okay, that doesn't apply anymore, then just following our sort of wants without any sense of the cause and effect or the validity and the value of our intentions behind, and making good intentions or having an idea of how intentions interact with our actions, then we fail actually to be in control of our lives. This is a very disempowering place, and it gives a lot of sense of meaninglessness. So the result of nihilism is, as Elizabeth says, it will impede awe, appreciation, and the practice of faithing. We'll miss the amazing experience of being alive and being present within a world that with people, objects, phenomena, and so forth that are incredible, like we talked about in the first chapter. Neil Armstrong's, here in honor of, that's actually exactly 50 years ago, right? Neil Armstrong's experience traveling to the moon. And as a result, also beginning to have this experience of living in this awe, what we can call faithing. By the way, class, please do read this amazing sutra called the Verses of the Faith Mind. It's in the reading material. No? So then the last section of chapter 3, the viewless view. I prostrate to he who has abandoned all views. It's Nagarjuna. This is Nagarjuna's praise of the Buddha, by the way. Yeah? That's the beauty of the Buddha. The Buddha went beyond philosophy, beyond dogma, beyond the insecurity that doesn't want to look. The Buddha looked. That brought enlightenment. But this didn't bring a new rigid philosophy. It brought awakening, the falling away of the need for these handles. So with that kind of incredible openness, we might think that there's nothing to hold on to. And hence Elizabeth quotes this classic quote from Chögyam Trungpa. The bad news is you're falling through the air. Nothing to hang on to, no parachute. The good news is there's no ground. So what we're talking about here is not about nothingness. This is not intended to leave us feeling that there's nothing there. This is not merely leaving us suspended. And Elizabeth says, particularly then talking about the quote from Trungpa Rinpoche, she says, I hear him, meaning Trungpa, in the spirit of the Buddha and Nagarjuna, playfully poking fun at our tendencies towards the extreme of eternalism, clinging to existence, and nihilism, fear of extinction, both of which express our inability to rest in the infinite nature of contingent expression. So we're not with the middle way. This is Madhyamika people. This is Prajnaparamita, emptiness, shunyata, wisdom. Does not mean that we're introducing a new view, but it's actually that we could adopt this angle, that we could be free from dogmas. It's subtle, and we might think, oh, isn't that tricky? Isn't that a new idea then? Yeah, we have that temporarily as an indication of a way to go, but that is definitely the objective, and that is what defines the sage, that is what defines the Buddha. It is this freedom. The teachings on emptiness are about waking up and seeing much, much bigger. This is what we're doing with the teachings on emptiness. We're not saying there's nothing. It's about actually taking away the blinkers and the dark sunglasses that prevent us from seeing properly. Elizabeth says the purpose of the investigations we have explored have one aim: to liberate you from the limits of dualism, such as belief and doubt, eternalism and nihilism, ground and groundlessness. She says trying to imagine a life beyond ground and groundlessness can be a philosophical stumper for the dualistic mind, which is precisely why we keep turning to direct experience as our method of exploration in this book. And let me just say here, this is where Elizabeth is very helpful, because in some of the classical presentations, there's a sense that the audience already is well familiar with this is familiar territory. And there is a tradition of introspection also where there's a humble awareness of how the mind operates, which is not necessarily something that how we were brought up. And so when she's presenting this, it's much more grounded in examples and intuitive examples and so forth, what she talks about turning to direct experience, rather than some of the philosophical principles that if you come across some of the Madhyamika reasoning and so forth, it might actually just be difficult to approach. And of course, just basically the idea of going beyond something that is, we could say, this is it, this is real, and this is not real. Going beyond that, is basically incomprehensible to the dualistic mind, because the dualistic mind by nature thrives, it can only survive on setting up these dichotomies. It actually bounces off these extremes. It's a hoax, it's a non-existent, but it thrives in this confused shadow of the dualism that operates with these essentially non-existent concepts, is and isn't. She says, you might compare this natural ease to returning home after a long, arduous journey. Perhaps grace has, in moments, felt so familiar to you that you may have even wondered if you had ever actually left it. So there might be a place where we'd actually find comfort in not being worried or concerned about asserting this or that, and simply just relaxed in an open, non-conceptual or less conceptual condition of just marveling, appreciating what we are talked about here: grace, the beauty, the natural perfection of things. And that feels right, doesn't it? There's also the classical example of how it feels is like if we worked hard for something and it's done, we can actually sit back, relax. We feel that we've accomplished, there's nothing left to do. So this is where in the Heart Sutra we have this mantra. First, the Heart Sutra operates with dismantling our assumptions, and then says, gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, and so forth. Actually, it goes katagata, paragata, parasamgata, bodhisoha. But anyway, we're just here concerned with the first part, where literally it means gone beyond, gone completely beyond. And what is it we're going beyond? It's not going into some new place or some new special zone. It's going beyond this and that, the dualistic views. So it has nothing to do with retreating away from the world. It has to do with looking at the world and seeing it for what it is, but without holding on to these extremes. These this and that's and so forth, these dualistic positions, that's what we're going beyond. And that's why it's referred to as the middle way, Madhyamika. Elizabeth says the middle way refers to what the Buddha experienced when everything extraneous to the nature, meaning all extreme views, falls away and one sees the naked truth, unimpeded by one's own misunderstandings. So the middle way is seeing things for without our projections, just actually, beginning to see. It's not about adopting some new glasses that are called the right view. Now I'm wearing the right view glasses. taking glasses away altogether, taking the shades away. That's seeing the nature. And then there's this very profound quote from the 9th chapter, stanza 34, of The Way of the Bodhisattva, the wisdom chapter here, where it says, "When thing and non-thing both indeed are absent from before the mind, nothing else remains for the mind to do but rest in perfect peace, free from concepts." So with the middle way, what Chandra, Kirti, Nagarjuna, and Shantideva, they all want is not for us to become incredibly sophisticated philosophers, which we might think if we study the middle way, but on the contrary, actually, to just actually arrive at a place of peace. We don't have to, we first establish something through our understanding, analysis, and so forth. Then we can rest, we can experience awe, we can experience simplicity, and so forth. It's not that thoughts are not going to happen. Of course they happen, but we might not follow after them. And that's where it's so helpful for us to practice meditation. Elizabeth says, Shantideva's statement clarifies a crucial point. The middle way is not yet another view to cling to. It is a way of being that expresses humility and openness, in which there is no affirmation or denial. It was from this place of unshakable confidence that the Buddha, in what is known as, in the Buddhist tradition, as the lion's roar. There must be a word missing there, but anyway, we could say it was from this place that the Buddha, of unshakable confidence, that the Buddha taught then in what is known as the lion's roar. I mean, this is where the Buddha was coming from. Yeah. Have to look into that again. Elizabeth says, the lion's roar emphasizes the ease, composure, and confidence that accompany resting in the middle way of being. So that's the nature of a sage. You know, the sage is not worried. The sage doesn't have anything to lose, has nothing to gain, is content, is fearless. The Buddha, the great accomplished masters, the siddhas, the lamas, the rinpoches, the great masters, the genuine sages, they rest in this unworried condition. And it's associated with the lion. Elizabeth says, to be able to tolerate the magnificence of the nature of emptiness without clinging to existence and non-existence is what we have been referring to as faithing. In this way, you might have already begun to draw a correlation between faithing and middle weighing. So this is resting in this place. It's openness and humility. Bringing together faith and the middle way has been my challenge and vision in writing this book. So this is important because on one hand, we have the very deconstructionist approach of the middle way. And then also we have the whole, particularly when it comes to Tantra, to Vajrayana, the whole engaging of the dimension of faith and the middle way, the whole wonder and awe that is expressed in the path that takes this as its, you could say, method, which is then the Vajrayana that takes this condition of the inexpressible quality of awakening onto the path as deity, mantra, and wisdom. So it's so important for us, particularly, but also not just Vajrayanas, but in all aspects of the Buddhist tradition. We're not just going into a place of not. We're going through a place of deconstructing both the assertion and the opposite, the not, and we break through this duality and into something that is the great wonder of enlightenment. It is, she says, it belongs to us all in that there is nothing more than it is, nothing more than discovering who we truly are. So, as it says in the Sadhana Mahamudra, we awaken to the wisdom that we were born with. Perfect. We might discover perfect in the absence of, oh, by the way, sorry, drum roll, new chapter. Okay. Citizenship. We're inhabiting this world. We're citizens. We might discover perfect in the absence of duality and good versus bad. That's where we're beginning to operate with this notion of awe, and then also the notion of perfection. It is the scope of grace and the mind that is in awe of its fathomless universe. So this is familiar ground. This is what we've been operating with. Yeah. But this is discovering, if you like, perfection. And this at no point is denying something in terms of, you could say, our ordinary life or suffering and so forth. But it's beginning to understand the intrinsic nature of our reality. So this does not mean that we're not talking about rarefied moments divorced from our ordinary gritty reality. This might come to us in glimpses, but when we're discovering these glimpses, we're also seeing how they are relevant and, in fact, present within the nature of our ordinary gritty reality. They're not particular states, they're more ways that we see clearer this greater reality. So we're not retreating into something else. It's seeing, it's wider seeing, vipassana. She says, in life, all is fundamentally linked to our sense of well-being. As we have discussed at length, disturbing emotions arise only when we have already decided what something is, and when we fail to look at people or situations as part of the play of mutual causality. More specifically, all serves as protection from fundamentalism, rightness, and despair. So when we get all wound up, so-and-so, this, I hate it, or I must have it, then we are failing actually to understand how there is nothing there that we're attributing solidity. They're just disturbing emotions that actually veil our seeing clearer that things are just part of a web of changing conditions. Without openness, we miss valuable points from others or from situations. So when we're already decided how things are, we're right, then we miss the point. We don't hear, we don't feel. And even we come in with good intentions. The good intentions, they don't really play out because we are operating from the point of view of righteousness. And that's then where things fail because of our rigidity and the reactivity that comes from our existing assumption, I am right, and also then the reaction in how this rightness, this stiff, rigid thing it bumps into reality all the time. Elizabeth says, we lose our ability to respond with clarity, efficacy, and tenderness. So that's also when we have to deal, let's say, with a negative situation, we might have to operate, we need clarity, we need to be efficient, we need to be soft. But the thing is, when we come in with, I'm going to promote peace in this violent world, and it's a really bad, violent world full of evil, violent people, then our insistence on peace fails because we're rigid. We're not actually communicating with the people we're perceiving or dealing with. We're lacking in clarity. As a result, also, we don't really know how to handle the situation. We become less effective. And we're not really understanding that intrinsically, these so-called bad, violent people who we want to teach peace, they are actually just lost in their aggression and their failure to be peaceful. So this runs all across the board in whenever we walk in with, I'm right. So also, as we have seen here with rightness, then we become overwhelmed. Like maybe it's just too much. Oh, we can't get world peace, or we can't deal with the conflicts that we're up against, and then we lose heart and we give up instead of just feeling our way into what can be done and doing it step by step. Then again, there was that we might be emotionally tied up and so forth. That's only good. It's with like Joanna Macy responding to this person in the book, mentioning in there, as it mentions in the book about this despairing person. It's good. It's good that we're not numb, that we're not unfeeling. Elizabeth says, a tender heart has unlimited give. It can accommodate the full spectrum of sentient experience. If we allow our heart to continuously break as a practice, we will make space for the infinite suffering and beauty of our world, excluding nothing and no one. So why not let it break? I often thought a heart that's broken a lot becomes bigger and bigger. So we should definitely be sensitive to the suffering of the world. And that is the nature of the Bodhisattva. We'll see what Bodhisattva is. Unfreezing our heart, we break free from the stagnation of wanting rightness. In that selfless space, heartbreak and despair tends toward compassion. Non-dual perception of perfection is not about ignoring the suffering. It's not about pain and pleasure being annulled into a numb and neutral state. So we've already looked at what it means to unfreeze our heart and breaking free of this rigidness around rightness. And when we begin to feel the pain of others and the despair that we might have in that regard, that's a good thing. It's being sensitive, not removed. That's part of being selfless. So when we're beginning to have a non-dual experience of reality and beginning to see perfection in the sense of the awe and the things free from our overlay of our projections, it has nothing to do with retreating into a particular kind of state of not being sensitive to what others are experiencing. It's just beginning to be free from our limitation and beginning to see the greatness of our reality, but it's certainly not about ignoring the suffering of others. This non-dual experience of perfection is not about pain and pleasure being annulled into a numb and neutral state. So this we can probably see in terms of our own world, but we can also see it in terms of great sages. That's the last thing they are. The last thing they are is numb or neutral. So this is not about blaming the world. This is not about us saying, I'm in a spiritual path, and the world is an evil place, and the world is not for me, it's not helpful what's happening in the world. I need to retreat away from the world. That's exactly what we're not doing. Everything that happens to us, we see that as a challenge. Elizabeth has this jokes a bit like saying, ha, now I have an opportunity. Now I'm being challenged. So that's where we are integrating that as the path. Everything is seen as an opportunity to go beyond our limitations. So we're living in the world. We're not against ourselves and our reactions. We're not being hard on ourselves, but we're also being willing to be present in our reality. And that's continually an opportunity for us to go beyond this impossible project of sustaining ourselves as right. It's about engaging. The commitment to value everything presents us with a way out of victimhood and is the ultimate support for growth and healing. It's not just an attitude, but requires the insight that is able to see through delusion. After all, how can you take on a challenging experience if you don't understand that it does not, by its very nature, exist as it appears? Again, we find ourselves returning to the essential insight we have been exploring in this book. Because everything leans, things do not possess intrinsic characteristics from their own side, and hence cannot be known in a determinate way. So we need to understand how this perspective is about us relinquishing an old habit that takes us back into a place of victimhood and fragility. This requires meditation. It requires that we understand what's being said here, that we apply it, and also that we give ourselves a moment to just settle, that we practice meditation. But what we are is breaking something. We're breaking some assumptions. So we are understanding that our assumptions don't hold up. And that's where we need to continually come back to this insight. Everything leans. Now, we might claim to be open-minded, but our set of opinions make us fundamentalists. So we might have, I'm an open-minded person. They're not open-minded. They should be open-minded, and so forth. So we very often have rigid positions, right? She says, fundamentalism is simply the inability to bear the fathomless nature of things. Why not affectionately call it mind at its worst? So, of course, we naturally have fundamentalism, but the thing is, it actually is not helpful. So we could just say, well, I seem to have that, and that's just me at my worst, or that's mind at its worst. And so, oops, here I go again. Mind as its worst. Huh? No need to be hard on ourselves in this regard. Just check it out. She's saying we should look at it, look how it operates, because it is where we have the what takes us up and what takes us down. We should look at and identify how we tend towards this rigid mindset as per our habits. Knowing this is knowing where we close down. This is where we go wrong. And we can see how we can move in to this and this greater perspective that's through loosening practice and so forth. And then sometimes we fail and we move out of this grace. So we need to identify the dynamics of this. We are capable of confusion, yes, but we're also capable of moving out of it. We are trying to find our place within the great nature of interdependent expression, which you could call mind at its best. So there's two ways: our fundamentalist mind, which is mind at its worst, and then there's the humble, interested mind of grace that we could call mind at its best. So we really need, this is such an important point. This is where we as practitioners could see what tends towards samsara, what tends towards enlightenment. This is where we need to, there's no rules here, it's about us in our own practice. And that's also where all the various aspects of the path becomes very, very relevant in this process. Burning with love in a world we can't fix. Our endeavor is not religious, but rather a test of what we as a human being can become, the grace unfolding of our potential. This is Ziga Kongtrul speaking, and Elizabeth says, because everything leans, you belong to something much, much greater than what you may often refer to as the world or my life. You belong to something greater than your community, political party, nation, or even this magnificent planet Earth. You are a noble citizen of the boundless field of contingent relationship, praticca samutpada. This is where we live. We might have these labels, my, this, that, and the other, but we are in fact living within the immediate reality of something that cannot be grasped. And so our reality is far greater than the labels. As everything leans, we belong to something greater. We are citizens of a boundless field. This insight might bring fierce tenderness because we're sympathetic to the world around us. We cannot isolate ourselves from the world. So this experience, the spiritual experience of understanding dependent arising, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not us on our own. It's not as if we can go into retreat and we hold the world outside. It's not at all like that. We're continually experiencing our world in terms of ourselves, but also the relationship to the body, to our earth, to the earth that we're sitting on, the pillows that we're sitting on, the roof that we're underneath. Our world, it's not really clear where we and our world begin and where we end and so forth. Yeah, we're continually in this relationship. And that includes, of course, the world, all sentient beings. Then quoting Shantideva, just as hands and other limbs are thought of as the members of a body, can we likewise not consider others as the limbs and members of a living whole? So that's how we should see ourselves. We are completely related. There's the branch, the trunk, and then there are the branches, all as part of a tree. Elizabeth says, I do believe Shantideva is introducing us to a plan of action, and it is timely, because to look honestly at our place in the nature of Praticca Samutpada, as we have been doing thus far, has provided us with a realistic and intelligent working basis or ground for creating grace. But this alone will not be enough. We will need some infrastructure to support awakening. Let's call this the path. And of course, the thing is that we're just arriving at this out of, I'd like to do this because it sounds nice. We have actually analyzed and looked at this. We're not arriving at Praticca Samutpada as something mystical, but on the basis of seeing something that's for real. But then now that we've seen it for real, we need to actually begin to have a handle on it in terms of extracting ourselves from our sort of diminishment and confusion into awakening. And that's where we're going to have to do something. That's the annoying thing with the Buddhist path. We have to travel. We have to do something. Then again, it's a good thing. So we have a realistic foundation based on what we have studied thus far. Now we need to integrate the experience of grace. We need infrastructure, the path. The Mahayana has a plan for awakening based on Praticca Samutpada. Now, seeing our connectedness with the world around us is extracting ourselves from this absorption into ourselves and becoming sensitized to a wider world of sentient beings. And so the Bodhisattva, at this point, organically, the path opens up into the journey of the Bodhisattva, which is the awareness of the world. We're not isolating ourselves. We're not saying, this is not my problem. Yeah, the world is us. The Bodhisattva says, beings are limitless. I vow to free them all. And Elizabeth invites us to accept this as an invitation, a proposal. We might wonder, how could we ever do that? What does it mean to free someone? How could one free them all? So it might seem impossible, but again, it's more about a shift in our way of seeing things. Yes, beings are limitless, and their suffering is also limitless. So I'll have to expand the realm of my care limitlessly in order to include them all. The Bodhisattva is not acting from the point of view of wanting to be something amazing, but it's just beginning to see the world and seeing beyond the ordinary limitations that we have imposed on ourselves. The term here is bodhicitta. This is what we call this. It's this attitude. This is translated as awake heart. Awake, we can see. Heart, we care. It does not separate the clarity of insight from responsive compassion. And let me just say again that here we don't just have, some this is not just some nice ideas from somebody with some nice sweet sounding sort of concepts, but it's what we have here is really 2,500 years of Buddhism served up in language that enables us to connect with this. Of course, what we're talking about here is wisdom and compassion in unity, which is the nature of bodhicitta. So it's just such a delight that we have Elizabeth, who enables us to have different language that perhaps we can go at these concepts from or with. So the thing is that we're not operating from the point of view of wanting an ideal world. The world is, by nature, sentient beings are suffering. Tongtse Rinpoche famously says we cannot fix samsara. He sometimes says you can try and stack those strawberries on top of each other. It doesn't work. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that, okay, you can't fix samsara, I'm out of here. No, we are there, and samsara is, yes, it's painful, but it doesn't mean that life is painful. That's not the point. We're not saying life is painful, but we're talking about sentient beings who don't get what life is. They miss the point about life. They miss the point about reality. And as a result, they suffer. We care about them. Those who live with this are called bodhisattvas. We could say the courageously awake. Changchup Semba. Changchup is the awakened condition here as something which we can see, in which we live, we align ourselves with, and it comes with courage. Sempa, pa means po, means someone who is a hero or is courageous. Now these bodhisattvas, they what makes them tick is sentient beings. They wish to be there for them. Bodhisattvas are okay. They're sort of living in grace, in awe. And they're aware that sentient beings are missing the nature of reality. So hence, the bodhisattvas live to serve. Choice. We live within moments, constantly affecting each other and creating unpredictable chaos at many levels. Yet within this same chaos is born all the physical and psychological order that we know. I didn't get that in here, but actually, Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche, he once said something to me. Actually, I wrote it down, and unfortunately, I had a notebook with some of these things that he said, but this was in 1985. I remember in the spring, we were receiving some reading transmissions from Dingo Chenzo Rinpoche, and we were sitting outside, and Rinpoche, he said a few things, and one of the things he said, which I still remember, he says, "You will not find a solution to the problem outside of the problem itself." And I think this is where we're looking at. We have a problem, but the problem is sort of pregnant with its own solution. We can say it's innately freed from any absolute quality. And so it's within the seeing of what the problem actually is that we're free. Elizabeth says, because everything leans, you belong to something much, much greater than what you may often refer to as this world or my life. You belong to something greater than your community, political party, nation, or even this magnificent planet Earth. You are a noble citizen of the boundless field of contingent relationships. I think I got something wrong. I've quoted that earlier. Anyway, Pratisha Samudpada, yes. So how do we work with praticca samutpada? Now we've seen that everything leans. Well, once we see that everything leans, we're actually standing in a very empowered position, because we understand that things, they exist in a web of conditions that we can work with. We might not be able to understand the whole web, but we certainly can see that what we're doing has an impact, and this is a very empowered place. Now, the workings of praticca samutpada in terms of the conditioned nature of how things are what we call karma. Things are made up of actions, the way that we see them, the way that we relatively construct things, the way that they relatively function. When we begin to look into karma, and she also quotes Traleg Rinpoche from his work on this, we understand that karma embraces the web of complexity. This means it's impossible for us to actually say that's how it is. It depends. So it's never, ever simplistic. It has nothing to do with this sort of idea, well, that's your karma, mate, you know? Yeah, you did this, then that happens. That never applies. Yes, things come about due to actions in the past, but this is not something that's understood in a simplistic way. We naturally abide by karma in going about our life. So our knowledge is intuitive in the sense that we understand that what we do has an impact and we can create the conditions in our life. So as a matter of fact, karma is not something that's alien to us or an alien concept. It's perhaps a new word, and there is a science around this that we might not be entirely familiar with, but it is something that we by nature, we intuitively operate with all the time. So this practicality of karma is the way that we understand our world. And also this means also we understand how things exist in relationships. Everything that's happened, even the unwanted. Let's say we're hit by a snowstorm. Well, the snowstorm actually might be very inconvenient, but in and of itself, the snowstorm consists of perfectly shaped snowflakes. This doesn't mean that there is some sort of like greater idea that everything's just meant to be in one particular way or another. Not at all, but it's more that we understand this web of causes and conditions. Actually, this is one of the points that we'll be looking at in the context of the study on Mondays in the month of August in the Sutra of the rice seedling, which is about understanding that things, there's no sort of some big major principle, is rather just continually you have causes and conditions. So in that this is so complex, we can never predict what comes next, but we can certainly work constructively with our given conditions. So whatever situation we find ourselves in, there's a possibility that we can work constructively with whatever comes up. So Elizabeth gave some examples in terms of what could happen if we launch from a great height. Well, obviously that's not a good thing. We could fall, but then again, we could have something that could enable us to glide. Similarly, also, we might not get what we want in terms of our love relationships, but then again, we could take this passion into a greater place and so forth. We have the power, and we have the power and the choice. Now, when we talk about lineage, what we're talking about here is aligning ourselves with a sanity that we naturally possess. This sanity has been expressed throughout the line of sages that come down to us. So when we find that we can recognize, let's say, the sanity of the Dalai Lama or sanity of a great sage and so forth, it's really just an expression that we have this sanity within ourselves. Yes, it's a lineage. There's beings who have manifested this this natural disposition we have. And so us wanting to connect with this is not necessarily wanting to go into a place of safety or joining a fat club, but it's about actually connecting with our natural disposition. And in doing so, there's not a given set of rules and so forth. We actually are continually operating with experimentation. And we might call it this, that, and the other. We can call it pratitya samutpada or whatever, but it is about us getting to know the world. So we continually operate with looking how the world operates. We navigate life. We find out how things work. We might sometimes go against, hit ourselves against the wall. We might break the rules and so forth, but we're continually testing and navigating and experiencing and feeling. And living in this process of experimentation, it leads us to insight. And like Elizabeth says, it's through this playful experimenting that the Buddha found enlightenment. So here at the end of the chapter, she says, at times you have a glimmer of seeing the world as being unconditionally perfect. Where do such experiences come from, you might wonder, and why do they come and go? So we might sometimes have a mind that is very open, and then again, there might be times when we don't have it. So we are continually working with sensing and being aware, knowing what's happening within ourselves. Sometimes the mind is one way, very open, sometimes it closes down. Again, like we looked at earlier, mind at its worst and mind at its best, right? Anyway, looking into this way that the mind operates, yeah, she continues. These were the types of questions the Buddha asked himself on his way to awakening from delusion. He relentlessly engaged in playful experimentation until he played his way into grace. This is how he discovered the path of awakening. Okay. Questions? Anyone? Very welcome to ask questions. Then again, and what I hope this is, you've read the book, it makes sense, and at this point I'm just, how do you say, stating the obvious. So just reiterating a bit here, and now you might have read it in one way, now you hear my angle, and again, this hopefully prompts reflection, and certainly with regards to the profundity of this is something I think we can read again and again, and certainly also it is the foundation really for the practice of meditation and the practice of everyday life. So meditation and post-meditation, essentially what we call Shila and Samadhi. So, okay, all very straightforward, but always good to recap and reflect. Thank you. Okay, thank you. That reassures me. That reassures me. So good. Thank you for reassuring the lecturer. That's good. Good. Anyway, rejoicing in the wonder of this work, then we'll continue next with the next chapter, which is then living tradition, which will be the last. And like I said, I would like to maybe just take this as a way of leading up to some of the more traditional ways of seeing this. I'll see what the time affords, but anyway, this is what we'll be looking at next time, the last chapter of the book, and maybe some classical examples of how this is conveyed in the classical language. Thank you very much for joining me here. Okay, someone says, it's all really, really good. Thank you. That's good. Someone says, I appreciate the opportunity to go through the book slowly and try it and put it into practice, especially those times when I really think I'm right. But that is going to cause a lot of trouble. I just stop and sit in the middle of all the leanings and grit my teeth and everything is okay. Yes. Now, I think also what Elizabeth was saying also is we shouldn't be hard on ourselves, you know. So we do. I also grit my teeth, but then again, there's a place where it softens up, and we actually begin to see the beauty in the other, or the beauty in the situation, which is the sort of the workability in the midst of things due to the leanings, right? Yeah. And someone says, I'm such a nihilist. This is perfect for me. I think we all have that, but yes, that's great. Good. All right. Thanks again, guys. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. Just as we're about to exit, then someone says, could you please say a few more words on how to connect with grace? Okay. View and practice. View is what Elizabeth is giving us here. It's informing us about the nature of how everything leans, and as a result, we begin to open up. And that is where we begin to have a more spacious appreciation that lies beyond the way that we normally limit or diminish or reduce things. And rather, we begin to have this sense of awe. And that's where we connect with goodness. I guess we could say in Shambhala speak, basic goodness. Buddhist lingo, we say Buddha nature, and so forth. Vipassana, if you like. So that's where we begin to have a vision, right? We begin to see things. This we then further integrate through two modalities. One is meditation, one is post-meditation. Meditation is the sitting, providing the framework of shamatha, and within that then the experience of vipassana, which is experiencing the freedom from the sort of the grip that our conceptuality normally has on us. We begin to experience freedom, wider perspective. That's meditation. Post-meditation is then to bring this lack of rightness and this openness, open dimensionality, compassion, caring into our ordinary life. Okay? Thank you for asking that. Okay. See you next time.